Hey everybody, welcome to Planet Coaster College. In this episode I'll talk about the aero looping coaster and show you how to build one, but before I do that, I want to have an extra coaster rant about the background of these coasters because it's actually quite interesting and surprisingly relevant when it comes to making one in the game. Now you can find it as the American Aero in the game, which is already very interesting because Aero here actually refers to the company that built these in real life. And Aero as a company is actually seen as one of the biggest, if not the biggest, pioneers in the roller coaster industry. They've built the first steel roller coaster ever, they've built the first steel roller coaster to feature inversions, and they've had countless other records and invented many other rides as well. And even though they went bankrupt around the turn of the century, many of their classic rides still stand and they really have a legacy as well. Now what separates this coaster from many of the other ones in Planet Coaster is that most of them are actually very modern. They feature very high-tech inversions and new trains and track types, whereas the old Aero coaster actually had its peak somewhere around the 70s and the 80s. There were still many made in the 90s, but around the 70s and the 80s is really when they were most innovative and when they were really up and coming. So many of these have much less smooth and less high-tech layouts, and they're much more just stringing together of different elements. And so in this episode I actually want to dedicate a bit of attention to how you can make one of these much more classic, maybe less interesting and exciting coasters, but one that is really just a traditional and almost nostalgic kind of ride. Now as always I want to raise the station up a little bit from the ground, and in this case especially I want to make the station a bit longer as well. These coasters usually have about 6 or 7 cars on a train in real life, and just adding one more segment to the coaster station allows you to put 6 cars on one train. These coasters often have a small section before the lift hill to just turn around, so I'm going to do something like that in here as well. And something that you might want to do when you build this coaster is just split it up into very small segments, almost in a roller coaster tycoon kind of sense, where you either just go down or go banking, but not make everything go as fluidly, since these were designed without the use of computers and people didn't figure out how to make tracks that smooth yet. Also, this track type just can't make very smooth coasters. Everything does go a little bit by bit and a bit more jittery. So I have this section where it goes down right here, and only when we're really flat I'm gonna turn around and go toward the lift hill right here. And actually right here I want to have it a little bit more toward the side here, so there'll be a bit more space to work around with. So I'm going to turn off the angle snap here and make sure that it's not exactly parallel alongside the station, but moves toward it just a bit, which you don't have to do, definitely not, but it's something that I want to do in this case since I'll have some loopings going in front of the station, and this opens up a little bit more space to do that. So as for the lift hill, it's just pretty much like you always have to do, just about 30 degrees should do the job, so I'm going to turn it up to 15 here, and that is just about a 30-degree lift hill. And we can pretty much build this at this point. Let's go up to a little bit less than 30 meters, which should already be quite a pretty good height for this kind of coaster. You do get them quite a bit lower as well, but in this case I do want to cram quite a few elements in this layout, so this should do for now. Small pre-drop section before we turn around so that we have enough speed to turn around here. And this is kind of what I mean with not making these coasters too smooth. You normally kind of want to put some banking offset over here and maybe have it turn as you're going into the banking. But in this case, you don't want to do that kind of thing. Just have a straight piece of track, just bank it a little bit before you go into the curve. You can actually make that a very short piece like this. And then we're just going to start into the curve. Again, I'm turning off angle snap here to get it to line up with the station a little bit more, like that. And after this we can go straight again, and that should be the pre-drop section. After this we can just go down and do the rest of the layout. And the first drop also doesn't really have to be too smooth. Just make sure that we're going down at a pretty decent angle, something like this, and have it go straight for an entire section. And in many of the newer coasters you would see that the drop is actually one very fluid motion, but in some of these older coasters you really see that there are just completely straight track pieces here and there. Now that we have the old crappy drop in there, it's pretty much time for the first real element of the coaster. which is going to be a looping in this case, just a regular old vertical loop. And the vertical loops of these coasters have this very signature teardrop style to them. The ones that the game gives you as a standard element aren't as teardrop styled as they are in real life. I wouldn't say that the shape is 100% like they should be, but they're pretty much good enough, and it takes a lot of time to make them yourself. I'll show that later in this video though. But for now, just for making things a bit easier and less time consuming, I'm just gonna put them together with the game. One thing to keep in mind here though is that you always want the second loop. If you're putting two loops in a row, which you do quite often see with these kinds of coasters, you want to make the second loop just a little bit shorter so it goes through it at a similar speed. Also, fun little fact for anybody who didn't know yet, loops are actually shaped like this instead of circles to keep the forces throughout the entire loop the same. Also, many of the classic models of this kind of coaster, like the corkscrew at Cedar Point or the Steam Demon at Great Escape, actually do have just one loop before they go into the rest of the layout. You don't really have to have two loops. It's just one of the things that you can kind of do with this. So what I want to do after this is actually get an element, like a small hill or a curve, after which you're going into the corkscrews, which is what you very commonly see on these kinds of coasters. So I'm just going to go up again. And most important thing to always remember with these kinds of coasters is to start banking before you go into your curves. And so because I want the other side of this hill to curve, I'm already going to start banking it before we actually get into the curve. And then while we have the curve that's going down, I actually want to bank it a little bit more toward the end. Because, namely, these coasters usually have a bit of a second act where they get into the corkscrews. And they usually get into the corkscrews from the banking that you already have of a curve, which might sound a little complicated, but I'm showing it off in a second. So basically we come out of the curve here, and we want the coaster to go into the corkscrew straight like that. But the issue is, if we add a corkscrew in-game, it's first going to go flat, and then it's going to go into the corkscrew. So we're going to have to build our own corkscrew here, which isn't going to be too big of a worry. It doesn't have to be smooth or perfect, because generally, if your coaster isn't very smooth, then you're on the right track to build a pretty good aero coaster. But at this point, it is quite hard to get that transition right from a corkscrew into a curve or the other way around. So what I usually do is, for the very first section from the curve into the corkscrew, I'm going to turn the banking to 90 degrees. I am going to rotate it 3 times to the side here, and also go up 3 times, which is basically the diagonal side of the corkscrew. Make that a little bit larger, kind of depends on the way it looks from the curve. I want to make sure that the transition is really right here. Let's see, just about a size like that should work. Then I'm going to turn off angle snap, and or I'm still going to have angle snap on, but I'm going to turn it to 45 degrees, which is how I usually make corkscrews. And I just realized this is a little bit of a belated corkscrew tutorial, but basically I want to make this section a bit smaller, and at the other side turn around, go down again, go to 90 degrees again, other side, there we go. And that should be a pretty decent corkscrew. It's by no means perfect, but with some smoothing tool later on you can definitely make it into a more than realistic corkscrew, especially with some of the quirks that we have on the side here. Can extend that a bit, smooth that out a little bit. It just kind of depends on how things are going. It takes some trial and error to get the shaping of the corkscrew exactly right, but as you can tell, we definitely have a corkscrew going on over here. Also, a quick idea is that a corkscrew always looks like a zigzag like this from above, so as soon as you have this kind of profile going on from a bird's perspective, then you pretty much have the right track shaping of a corkscrew. What you can also do if you're a lazy bastard is just finish off the top piece like this, make sure that it's exactly 180 degrees, and then go to the pre-given corkscrews, and at that point you can just take one of the corkscrews that the game gives you. And the second corkscrew is always a little bit easier. You can just do it the way that the game gives you the corkscrews. Now, for those of you who are making your own corkscrews, a very good way to check whether the corkscrews are decent and smooth enough is to look down at the side of the corkscrew like this, and if you've got a perfect round spiral going into the center, then the corkscrew is more or less fine. There are some disadvantages to using the in-game inversions because you can't actually smooth them out, and it just makes things a lot harder when it comes to coming up with transitions from other pieces of track. I've been testing the coaster, and because it's already losing quite a bit of speed at the corkscrews here, and aero coasters do usually end it with a helix or a little airtime hill after the corkscrews, I'm already going to end the coaster quite soon. So I'm going to head back to the back of the station and actually finish this before I make the rest of the track. Have a very slight incline, and this is where we're going to have the brake run as well as the block brakes for being able to run multiple trains. These kinds of coasters don't always run multiple trains, but in this case I kind of do like to do so, especially if you've got one of these larger aero corkscrew coasters or aero looping coasters. You're definitely going to want to add some block brakes to be able to store some extra trains. Also, in reality, very often there's a bit of a brake section right here where the coaster car slows down and where there's a transfer track on the side where they can store the extra train. So I want to have quite a lengthy brake run right here, and after that we can return to where the rest of the coaster is still hanging. So for me here, I'm just going to finish off the coaster in a pretty simple manner. Just going to make one last hill where it's going to have a curve as well, so I want to bank it first. Then we're going to have a straight section which is just a curve, pretty modular. And after that we have a section where it goes flat again and goes to a flat banking as well. Alright, so I finished the ride with a quick hill at the end of it and just a quick curve to turn around and get into the brake run. Gave it a new color scheme which is a bit more flashy, and that pretty much just finishes the ride. It's not a recreation of any existing ride, but it's definitely very similar to many of these rides. There are countless copies of the corkscrew coaster, which is similar to this coaster except without the loopings right here. There are many double loop, double corkscrew coasters, or just loop corkscrew coasters, but this one is just kind of a bit of an amalgamation of all the different things that they have in common. I would say the loops could be a little bit faster. You do see them a bit faster. They could just be smaller, but that aside, the pacing in the ride seems quite good, especially on the corkscrew where it just flies through these things, goes into the last hill right there, which has some very awful banking, but that was kind of what I was looking for, and into the last curve, which is a little bit sudden. I would have probably made a bit more space over here to get from the banked curve into the straight piece of track, but that aside, I am actually quite happy with it. Let's do a POV. So we're in it right now, and from the top of the lift hill going into that small pre-drop section, which you also don't really always have, but it's something which you do see a lot on these kinds of coasters and helps keep them somewhat compact. Into the first drop, which on this one is actually quite steep. Into the double loop, which, yeah, is a little bit slow when it comes to the pacing. But that aside, works out pretty well into what is usually the painful part of the ride, and into the terrible transitions of the corkscrews and the curves, which as bad as they are quite realistic, so I'll keep them around, and into the last curve, and from that, for the brake run, braking a little bit, some block brakes at the end, and that is where we could store the second train if we wanted to have a second train. Let's actually add one, turn it to block sectioned, and add a second train. That's where that train is going to want to wait. Now here's me trying to capture the classic aero coaster feel with a bunch of scenery around the coaster, just very simple and very rustic. But this is the kind of thing where you usually see these kinds of coasters either in a small theme park or somewhere in the back of a Six Flags park that they don't really care about and put VR goggles on. But yeah, usually these are pretty rustic and very nostalgic kind of rides. And also the block brakes were a bit of an issue for me at the lift hill, since the train actually cleared the circuit just after the first car reached the lift hill, which meant that it's gonna have to wait on top of the lift hill for the other coaster car to finish the block that it's on, in which case I just turned up the waiting time in the station to 80 seconds, and that pretty much fixed that. It's not the greatest thing, and it doesn't give you the greatest stats either. The excitement is just about 4.5, I believe, 4.7, but at least the fear rating and the nausea rating are a bit lower than that. And in general, the ratings are kind of like a family coaster, not too bad, it's not too expensive of a ride either, and if you really want to go for a classic aero look even in your career or scenario, you could definitely use it. Now that would have been all for this video if I wanted to leave it at just the coaster that I made, but there's one thing that I want to add, and that's that there are also larger aero loopers, which came about especially in the 90s. A still standing example of it is the Viper, but most of them have already been removed. which broke some records for the largest inversions, etc. But they were pretty weird coasters because they still used the elements that Arrow was using before that, just on a much larger scale. So what you would see with a looping, for example, on many of the Arrow mega loopers, is that instead of having a completely large looping by just taking the in-game loop and drawing it out like this, the loopings would often first have a large section where it goes up in a very gentle way, going toward the loop for quite a while, and then you would have the very standard teardrop shaped loop. So to make one right now would be to just add this large section going up like that, and then when you get to the actual loop itself, start to rotate it a bit so you can actually go to the side, make the top and make that very small just to get the teardrop shape in there. And the same goes for the other side right here. Again, it's very small. And then we're gonna make the track a bit longer again and go down to the other side, which is always a bit tricky actually, because you're gonna have to like rotate it to go to the middle right here, and actually go into the other direction on the other side of the loop. Basically, it's gonna have to rotate on the top of the looping, and you kind of have to figure out how the looping is gonna go. But you generally want a looping to look like a Z when you look at it from the top. So this one doesn't have enough Z right there, and I'm gonna have to add a little bit more right here. That should just about do it, and then a whole lot of smoothing and correcting some minor track pieces should get the teardrop shape in there at some point, and that's pretty much how these loopings would be. There are some examples of some really large Arrow loopings that are actually regularly shaped, like the Tennessee Tornado, but that's getting into some completely different things. I would actually say, if you're interested in Arrow and how they developed and a bit of general coaster history as well, there is a documentary of the American coaster enthusiasts called The Legacy of Arrow Development, which is a really cool documentary that you can watch if you're interested, and it can certainly teach you some stuff about roller coasters as well. Just a quick tip. Anyway, that's it for the weird mega looper looping. There are two more elements that I want to talk about that you could see on Arrow coasters and that you might want to try and mess with. One of them is the bat wing, which is a very common element on some of these mega loopers, and it should already be a standard element in the game, which you can find like this. But I have to say it's a bit of a strange bat wing, because many of the real bat wings enter quite a lot higher than the lowest point of the bat wing. So you can also kind of make your own bat wing in a sense. Something like that. And then another loop on the other side, back into another corkscrew as well, and that is basically a bat wing. There's also the cutback, which is an interesting element that's found on Dragonfire, which is a corkscrew in and then another corkscrew out in the same direction, so you get a shape like this. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about the Arrow looping coaster. Thank you guys so much for watching this, and if you have any feedback or comments, don't be afraid to leave them in the comment section of the video, and I'll see you guys in the next video.